We are Pro Cannabis Media.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of In the Weeds with Jimmy Young, a very special podcast that we do every week here at Pro Cannabis Media. And we are so proud to be joined this week by Brian Vicente. Now, you may not know his first name, but you might know his partner's name alongside Vicente-Sederberg, one of the most famous and well-respected law firms in the cannabis space. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
It was 2012. Right? Almost 10 years ago that Colorado went legal. You guys were involved with that. Do you, at any time, do you pinch yourself to say, I can't believe that was 10 years ago?
Yeah, it is remarkable. It was, we were up against pretty great odds. Marijuana had been illegal for 80 years and we were able to turn the tide in Colorado and then lead to positive things in Massachusetts and other places around the globe. So there's been a lot that's happened in the last 10 years and a lot of progress, but yeah, and sometimes it seems like it flew by and sometimes it seems like, 200 years ago.
That's right. And 2020 seems like it was about 20 years long, right? But it was a significant year in the cannabis history because many states deemed cannabis sales as an essential part of their economy. Is that the only positive thing that we could take out of 2020? But it's a big one, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was a tough year, obviously. There was an important election in November where a lot of people view it as a positive to have an executive change. Mm-hmm. But I think, the idea that cannabis was deemed by, a dozen plus governors to be essential, right alongside nurses and, grocery store workers and these folks that are really putting their butts on the line every day to service the public. Is remarkable, and it shows how far this issue has come and that a lot of the stigma around cannabis and cannabis users is starting to fade away.
And I'm not going to apologize, but I'm afraid I am from Massachusetts, and I was embarrassed that our governor was one of those states that didn't see the recreational adult use side of things to be essential, but medical, he did allow curbside, which was fine for those of us who carry medical cards, but still it was a little slap in the face to many dispensaries, including the first one in Boston to open up, Pure Oasis. I think it was like 8 days after they finally opened their doors, they had to close because they were an adult use recreational one. That leads me into my next question. And I'm sure you're familiar with Bruce Barcott's book, Weed the People. He did a great job, I thought, of chronicling the battle, if you will, in both Colorado and in Washington State. And one of the things that really stuck with me in that book was his own personal decision to understand that cannabis wasn't a drug issue, it was a civil rights issue. And now you're starting to see that even in Washington, D.C., and some of the talk about federal reform, tying it to social justice or social injustice. How do you view where the industry is with that? And are we finally going to do something to help the people that have been most impacted on the war on drugs?
Yeah, I mean, this is a remarkable moment in time. As you're aware and readers of that book are aware, cannabis prohibition is largely founded, in the 30s and the 20s in racist policies. They wanted to marginalize people of color, and they effectively did for about 80 years. It's interesting, when we legalized marijuana in Colorado, and I wrote that law and co-directed the campaign, we polled all the issues we could and said, what is it that can get voters to vote yes, to legalize? And, tax revenue, is it jobs, is it criminal justice resources? And we definitely included, what about social justice issues related to race, which were very important to myself and some of the principles of the campaign. And the voters weren't there. That's not what turned the corner for them. And so largely our focus was on like the fiscal issues and the criminal justice issues, better use of resources in our messaging, and we convinced voters. Since then, and in the preceding 9 years or so, the country has really shifted, and now any legalization law that passes really needs to have a firm backing in social equity provisions. And I think that's a wonderful thing. But it took a while for the public to get there, and it's just accelerated kind of the Black Lives Matter and so forth. So, and you know, we're very involved in DC and really pushing for federal changes there. And it's clear that if you're trying to push for you know, legalization without some social equity, then you know, it's a non-starter.
Right. And it does. And are you confident that Washington, D.C. is going to do something in the next 6 months to a year? Or are you still wary about our federal government?
I mean, I'm still worried about Congress, but I do think we're going to see something, right? I think we'll see banking for sure. But I think there's it's more likely than not we will see the big kahuna. When you have you know, Senator Booker, Senator Wyden coming together, you know, and Schumer, these are very powerful people right now, and they're saying this is a high priority for them. We know that Vice President Harris, this is an issue she's firmly behind, since she was the co-sponsor on the Senate side of the legalization measures. So I think the winds are at our back, and I think we've got a decent shot.
Well, we'll see. I have no confidence in one side of the aisle. Let me just say I am from Massachusetts. Okay, what can I tell you? All right.
Yeah.
I do want to talk a little bit about where we go from here after the fact. So if we get some kind of reform, will there be a big sigh of relief from the industry if they get rid of the descheduling of it, if they get rid of 280E, the tax code? I mean, or will it continue to move towards legalization, even if you only get decriminalization?
Yeah, well, I think, right, the most likely scenario here is we'll have an extension of the Cole memo, you know, formerly the Ogden memo, that basically allows state legal businesses to conduct whatever business they want, you know, in the cannabis space, whether that's medical or recreational. And it'll probably extend further than Trump in that they will essentially disallow raids of recreational shops if they're following state laws, right? And that was really, you know, disallowed for medical shops under Trump's regime and Obama. But I think there'll be more state level protection. And then, yeah, I think the industry would absolutely welcome any sort of change to make banking more streamlined, any sort of tax code, 280E fixes they could get. And certainly with banking, I mean, that's just a public safety issue. Like, if you can't get behind that, like having tried to prevent people from keeping large amounts of cash under their mattress, then like you're missing the point here. So I think, you know, and then the industry has a pretty robust lobby these days, and they're trying to get those things done.
I was certainly encouraged to hear the head of the IRS actually saying, yes, digital payments would be helpful rather than paying your taxes in cash. That was a positive anyway. I do want to go back to the states, and needless to say, right now, officially, there are 16 legal states, with Virginia coming on now through their legislative initiative. However, what's going on in South Dakota really has me concerned, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. When you're writing a question for a ballot, and of course you've got some experience, as does your law firm with this, how carefully do you have to look at the state constitution to make sure that the wording is proper? Because I look back at what happened to Nebraska, and they tried to do it and then it got blown up. So how do you structure the wording of these questions to make it as clear as possible?
Sure. Yeah, and I think you know, this has been an issue for years, right? How do you write? Because of course, all the first legalization states were those laws were written by people like me and you, right? That just folks that get the signatures, do the ballot initiative, get it on the ballot. They weren't done by the legislature, right? Now we're thankfully seeing Illinois and other places come forward, Virginia come forth with legislative laws. So when crafting those laws, when citizens are drafting those initiatives, they need to be extraordinarily careful about complying with state constitutions. Now, I would say I know my colleagues that wrote the South Dakota law. They're brilliant individuals. They've written many laws that have passed at the state level. I think what Nebraska, who overturned their medical law and disallowed it from the ballot, and then South Dakota, who just literally overturned the vote of the people, which is so distressing. What do they have in common? It's not that their initiatives were poorly drafted, in my opinion. It's that they have really conservative courts, right? And I think there's judicial activism going on there.
Interesting. So if you were a betting man, with the South Dakota question going before the state Supreme Court with, I believe, a federally appointed judge, I believe. And of course, the governor there is anti-cannabis. So what's your, do you think it'll stand up, or do you think it'll get tossed out? Really bothers me if it gets tossed out, by the way.
Oh, yeah, it's just straight slap in the face to the voters who passed it by a pretty large margin.
To democracy.
Yeah, to democracy. Yeah, this thing we call democracy that's by a thread sometimes it feels like. I do not have faith in those judicial officers. The right thing. So, and we're seeing this in Mississippi as well right now, which Mississippi, I mean, it's tough to think of a more conservative place in our country. They passed a medical marijuana law by a wide margin. I think it was like 70%. And that's caught in the court system, right?
Yeah.
Not because, in my opinion, not because it was poorly drafted, just because you have these sort of activist judges that don't want to see cannabis prohibition end.
That's just crazy. And of course, last time I checked, the only federal institution that can grow it legally for research is the University of Mississippi. By the way, do you have any idea how they ended up with that, getting that? Do you have any idea the history of that? How did they decide it would be the University of Mississippi as opposed to like the University of, I don't know, Maryland, which happens to be in the neighborhood, right?
Berkeley, yeah.
Yeah, Berkeley, which, I mean, come on.
More cannabis friendly. I think it came out of the federal IND Act, the Investigative New Drug Act, when they were allowing a certain number of individuals with AIDS to sort of access cannabis. And then I'm guessing University of Mississippi threw their hats in the ring for the people that would grow it. Apparently, I have some friends that have gone there to tour the facility, and it's like Fort Knox. It's like they have 8-foot concrete walls preventing the public from getting in to steal their anemic marijuana plants.
I was going to say, and it's crappy weed, from what I understand.
It's not good.
What can I say? Not that I've ever tried it from the University of Mississippi, let's just say. Let's get back to social equity for a second. In Massachusetts, they wrote the laws supposedly to help the social equity applicants without realizing that you actually still had to have access to capital to actually have an opportunity to get into this business in the state of Massachusetts. And then they decide to give an opportunity for delivery licenses to social equity applicants. I was absolutely shocked to hear that up until this year, delivery was not part of Colorado. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, correct. So it wasn't explicitly written in our legalization law, because again, we were just trying to see what the voters would pass, right? And it never passed before, so we didn't want to push the envelope too far. But we didn't disallow, right? We didn't disallow. So it just took a while, basically, for the state to sort of get their act together. They're creating this regulatory structure for cannabis, somewhat from scratch, hadn't been done previously for recreational purposes. And so they eventually got around to delivery. And there was a little bit of pushback from dispensaries that thought, they should hold on to their retail in-person market, but eventually people are getting on board with it.
I remember my first experience in California, and it was a delivery, and it was amazing. It was like the Fuller Brush salesman. You may not even be old enough to remember who they are, but they would come door to door and they'd show you their wares. And then and that was kind of like the experience I had in California visiting some friends there. But I want to ask you about home grow as an issue now. Some states have it, some states don't. Even Vermont, that has the opportunity to do it, now is going to actually try to increase the amount of plants that you can grow personally in your dwelling based on the adults in that dwelling. And yet New Jersey, no home grow. How important is it, especially for the medicinal patients, to have the ability to grow your medicine so it won't put you into bankruptcy? To me, it seems like it goes hand in hand, but for some reason, some of these states still don't get it. I think even New York is debating that too right now.
Yeah. There's, it's interesting. There's frequently a robust debate around home grow, no matter what state it is. And, people that are opposed to it are somewhat effective at saying, well, can you imagine someone growing next door to you? Imagine the smell, imagine the fire hazards and all this things that have no real scientific backing, but they're concerned. And so, what we found is places that allowed home grow, it doesn't affect the bottom line of dispensaries. Dispensaries still do plenty of sales, but it does allow, home growers and who are, of course, adults, and patients to have access to a product that they can grow themselves. And for medical marijuana patients, they have to, instead of spending, $300 on an ounce of marijuana, they're able to grow it themselves. That's saving a lot of cash from, in terms of how their their healthcare bills go. So I really think it for me, legalization, pure legalization, should absolutely include home grow.
Absolutely. It's a plant, for crying out loud, right? I mean, it's what I keep coming back to. It's plant medicine. And I've certainly learned to respect plant diets. I live with a couple of vegans, and it just blows. Their discipline is quite impressive, let's just say. I do not have that discipline, but I certainly, and we both share that plant medicine thing. Let's just say that too. But I do want to talk a little bit more about interstate commerce, because that seems to be the big bugaboo. A lot of people, a lot of cannabis advocates are afraid of federal legalization because they don't know what's going to happen state to state. Any idea how that might work out, or should it just be each state should have their own little economy? What's your feeling about that?
Yeah, so I think we should. Here's what I think will happen. I think we're going to mimic what happened with alcohol. So, alcohol was illegal in our country for 6-7 year stretch, and then when it became re-legalized, essentially the federal government allowed states to sort of set whatever rules they want. Right. So in Utah, they had to have a chastity curtain, and in certain states it was 18, it was 21 years old, what have you. But they didn't specifically allow interstate commerce immediately. Right. And I think that's what we'll see here is, the federal government will say, all right, Colorado, you can have whatever laws you want. Nebraska, you can make it the death penalty for marijuana. Whatever you want to do, it's your state law. But over time, those states will develop interstate compacts, and ultimately it'll become sort of a federally, the federal government will bless sort of state by state commerce. So I think that will take a good 4 to 5 years, but it could be that a place like Oregon very quickly hooks up with California, has interstate commerce there, but getting Oregon marijuana to Florida might take a good 5 or 8 years.
Absolutely. And look what they're trying to do. They passed hemp in the Farm Bill in 2018, and the federal government still can't come up with the right way to bring that to market. They continue to discuss those policies. I know you've actually talked about this in the past. Upside of the market, cannabis with THC versus hemp without THC. Is the hemp market going to be much bigger than the cannabis THC market?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the hemp market, in many ways was overlooked for a while. Now it's there's a hyper focus, right, on CBD and so forth, and has been for several years. And there's absolutely something to it, right? No question that has medical efficacy. At the same time, I think just the recreational market is robust. Look at the alcohol market. I mean, it's just going to be large. I think a lot of the future of hemp may actually be in sort of industrial purposes and so forth, things that we aren't really seeing as much of today as we did even 200 years ago. But I think, so hemp will continue to be robust, but I think the cannabis, the broader, THC market, in my guess, will be bigger, at least for a while.
What's Vicente-Sederberg working on now? What's on the docket, if you can share? What states might you be involved with right now?
Sure. Yeah, so we're involved in a lot of different states, trying to help guide state legislators, regulators, or even campaigns on ways to kind of either legalize marijuana or medical marijuana, or just change their state laws. A lot of we're doing some active work in Maryland. We're doing some active work in Mississippi. Providing comments in Ohio. Anywhere there's cannabis, we like to at least have some sort of a presence, say, hey, we learned a couple lessons in Colorado. Here's a couple things we did wrong. Try not to replicate that, but here's some things we did right and we've learned. And I think that's a good approach. Like, we're in it together. Let's try to develop these laws in a responsible way.
In it together, try to do the responsible thing. Wouldn't that be a novel way to approach government? Brian, it reminds me a lot of the 60s, what's been going on here in our country over the last few years. And it impacted my upbringing, there is no doubt. But the fact that it's now 50 years ago, I really worry and wonder, have we learned anything from the past? And will we actually see the lessons of the past dictate what happens in the future? Can you look in your crystal ball and predict what might happen in the next few years here in this industry?
Sure. Well, I think it's, I really think we're at a crossroads in our country, with the George Floyd and the BLM stuff, the cannabis legalization kind of catching fire. And then obviously COVID. I mean, a lot of people are looking in the mirror saying, is this the right way to approach life? I like to think some lessons have been learned in the last several years. Certainly on the cannabis regulation front, we've seen laws like Colorado's, which didn't have a ton of social equity. Now we're seeing places like Illinois and Massachusetts grab the bull by the horns a little more on social equity, which is wonderful. So I think things are trending our way. And at the end of the day, I mean, cannabis prohibition, my whole goal, I've been doing this for almost 20 years, was just to get people to think about marijuana more. If they could think about it more, they would start to learn about the history of why it became illegal. They'd start to think about, well, if I can't overdose from it, why is it,
Schedule 1. I mean,
Schedule 1,
right.
Getting people more and more educated, and that education is happening. So I think it'll take us to a good.
And lastly, when you talk about education, I'm someone who's mentored hundreds of young people in my career in broadcasting. And I was in front of a bunch of college students this past week in a virtual classroom. And of course, one of the questions came up about the age, adult use 21. And of course, I turned to the class and I go, I'm going out on a limb thinking none of you have any experience with cannabis, because after all, it's against the law for someone your age to be trying that. And of course, that got the biggest laugh of the day, right? So if we all recognize that, and we can send our 18-year-olds into the military, and we can send our 18-year-olds to vote on the leadership of their country, but you can't possess cannabis, or you can't even have a sip of a drink. Now look at Europe, where they have less alcoholism because parents in Europe bring their children up recognizing that they're going to try alcohol. They might as well do it from an educational standpoint. And it is education that drives it. Do you think ultimately we'll ever see the lowering of the drinking age and cannabis to 18?
I think we should. I agree with you. It should be lower. We shouldn't be criminalizing people who are 19 and trying cannabis or alcohol unless they're hurting someone else. I think it's gonna be a tough road to hoe to get there. 21's been pretty established for a long amount of time for alcohol. It's the framework for all the marijuana laws. So that might be an issue for 10 or 20 years down the road.
There you go. Well, I probably won't be around for that, but I wish you the best of luck down the road. How's that?
All right.
Hey, thank you so much, Brian Vicente from Vicente-Sederberg, someone who is really recognized as a legend in this industry. You're a trailblazer. I have the utmost respect for the work that you've done. So on behalf of other users, medicinal users, thank you for your hard work. And more importantly, thank you for your time here on In the Weeds.
My pleasure, Jamie. Great to see you. Thanks so much.
Nice to see you too. That'll do it for another edition of In the Weeds with Jimmy Young. Remember, it's a whole new world of weed out there. Use it responsibly. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Ben Schauer, New England rep for Salient Video Management Systems. Let me tell you what makes us different in the security space. We're your trusted advisors for all your security needs. I know how complicated the regulations are in cannabis, and working with Salient Systems will be the polar opposite of that. I give free consultations and will walk you through every step of the process so that you can get what you need at the price you can afford. We're robust, we're simple and scalable. We're Salient Systems, your solutions to all your security needs. Please contact me at the information below, and I'm looking forward to being your trusted advisor.
Weed Talk and In the Weeds are two productions of Pro Cannabis Media supported by Revolutionary Clinics, one of the top medical cannabis dispensaries in the Massachusetts area, now with 3 locations in Greater Boston, 2 in Cambridge and 1 on Broadway in Somerville. Rev Clinics has a patient-first mission. They will customize your needs as a medical patient with the proper titration and combination of strains, flavors, and products. Rev Clinics, where the patient comes first. Pro Cannabis Media programming is available live and on demand on our Facebook page at Pro Canna Media, on Instagram at Pro Cannabis Media, on LinkedIn also at Pro Cannabis Media, on YouTube and YouTube Live on Pro Cannabis Media, Twitter at Pro Canna Media, and on twitch.tv/pro-cannabis-media. So like, share, and subscribe to all of our content, newsletters, and shows live or on demand.
We are Pro Cannabis Media.